All right, well, welcome back to Green School. This is week 2, and today we're going to be diving into, I should be saying dig in, to soils, fertilizers, and amendments. I'm Katie Dunker. I'm the CSU Extension Statewide Master Gardener Coordinator, and due to the remote nature of Green School this year, I will be one of your primary hosts on your journey this spring. All right, so I have a few Green School announcements before I introduce my colleagues who will take the lead this week. There have been some course access issues, but most of them have been resolved at this point. So if you're still having any difficulty, please email me and the team at greenschool@colostate.edu. You can also chat with me through the Q&A feature today, and I'm happy to troubleshoot with you if you're still having any issues. I did want to just give you a note about our online courses. Soils is one of the largest and longest courses. So I know many of you spent hours this week in the material, and we truly believe that soils is foundational to the rest of our courses, which is why we want to start with soils, but we know that it is dense, literally, figuratively, all of it. So go at a pace that works for you, come and go as needed, and know that if you gloss over something or feel like you didn't really get a chance to understand a concept, you can always go back and dig deeper. Next week is botany, how plants grow. Another foundational course for gardening that is big. It's a large course as well. So knowing that soils and botany are longer, we've positioned the trees courses, which are lecture-based, after botany. So in a couple weeks, you're going to have a chance to do more listening than reading, and I think it'll be a nice break for people. And that will be followed by a week off, or what we've also dubbed as a catch-up week on the schedule. And that's intentional as well, knowing that these first few courses are really big. It's foundational. You're learning the platform that we use and how we're managing these weekly Q&As and whatnot. And so we do have a catch-up week on the schedule. So hang in there. Another just tip is that you may have noticed that Garden Notes is really pretty redundant of the online curriculum. And that's why we're not requiring that you read Garden Notes. It's really there as a reference point. It's great for note taking and reviewing the material in the future. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out there because I know some people may already be feeling a bit overwhelmed with the amount of content. So we like to keep it robust, but we also realize that comes with the danger of overwhelming. So, all right, I'm really excited to have my colleagues Amy and Cassie and Eric with me today. I'm gonna let Amy take the reins and introduce our speaker for today.
Great, thank you, Katie. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday morning. I'm seeing a lot of you for the first time, or you're seeing me for the first time. My name is Amy Lenz. I'm the horticulture and agriculture agent in Weld County, also covers small acreage management and the Master Gardener program there. I'm joined today by Cassie Anderson, my colleague from Adams County. She's the Master Gardener coordinator there. Cassie, say hi. And she's going to be working in the background on the chat box, on the Q&A and all that with me and Katie. And then our presenter today is a real treat. This is Eric Hammond, who's going to work with you guys and do a little bit of a soils, fertilizers, and amendments review first, and then he's going to take some questions. But just a little bit of background about Eric. Eric works for CSU Extension as the horticulture agent in Adams County. He recently took on the extra role of being their interim director. So he's got his plate full recently, but he works with clients and helps assist them with all of their horticultural needs, especially in the landscape horticulture area. He's very knowledgeable in the nursery industry. Eric attended Colorado State University, where he had received his undergraduate degree in natural resource conservation and management. And then later he got his master's of science in horticulture. His studies at CSU focused more on drought tolerant plants and evaluating woody plant materials. So Eric has a really vast knowledge of horticulture and woody plants, and especially soils. So he's going to be a great teacher for us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and we will be here for you if you've got any questions. Thanks, Eric. And you are muted, just in case.
Got it. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Amy. So like my colleagues mentioned, the plan for today is I'm going to give a short kind of review or kind of whirlwind trip through the soils world, focusing on things that are maybe really important, I think, or really more practical. This is kind of like, it shouldn't be anything that wasn't covered in the online, in the Canvas portion of the course, but maybe it should highlight that and kind of, or highlight areas that are important at that, and kind of be a supplement. And then we'll spend about the last half an hour just doing Q&A. So I believe the plan was, if you submit questions into the chat, most of them will just be answered after we finish with the little sort of lecture-ish portion of this. So the other thing we may do is at times I will open up the chat for you guys to type in some input, or to answer some questions, give ideas about challenges and soil management, things like that. And we'll do that briefly and let you put stuff in, then close it again. So that's our plan. So so here we go. Soil science for gardeners, or reasons to care about dirt. If I'd called soil dirt in my soil science class in my undergraduate work, I would have been given a low grade. So, knowing that it's not dirt, what is soil? And I think I'm going to start off right here by opening up the chat box, and then you guys type in things that are, what is soil to you? What is it made of? That's kind of what I'm looking for. So, like, what is it physically made of? And oh, Katie, I don't think I'm a co-host, so I can't actually open up the chat. But maybe get that in your head, the idea, what is soil? Start thinking over your class, and
I've opened it if you want to use it.
okay, cool. So chat is open. So if you guys want to type into chat just briefly, a couple words like, what is soil? What is it composed of? Is mainly what we're looking for. Sand, silt, and clay. I'm going to kind of read them as they come in. Sand, silt, and clay. Yep. An ecosystem. Yeah, there's a lot of living things in soil. That's an important piece of what we're going to talk about today. I see people putting water, air, right? Those things are in soil as well, and the pore spaces between the solid stuff. Organic. Soil does contain organic material. Yep. Parent material. Parent material would be the, I see that a few times. Parent material would be the rocks that soil weathered from. Small organisms, yet microorganisms. I see some very complete answers in here. Soil is composed of sand, silt, and clay, microorganisms, water, air, and dirt. Living things, bacteria, compacted clay. Yeah, for some of us, compacted clay is kind of what we're dealing with. Even that compacted clay has living things in it, though. Complex living system, habitat. Cool. I think you guys got all the big ones. Medium for plant growth. That's a great one, right? That's what we're all interested in. That's why we're here. Pores, and pores are really important. The blank spaces in soil between the solid stuff, super important. Minerals, metals, I think that's all getting around to plant nutrients being in soil. We'll talk about that. Water, air, and manure. Those are all things we might find in soil for sure. Rock material, yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to close it again. Thank you guys for putting in all that input. It seems like you're all on the right track. Soil is all those things that you guys mentioned. So in a well-managed Western soil, by Western I mean Western United States soil, might look something like this by volume. About 50% of the volume of the soil would be solid stuff. That would be your mineral component. That's all the parent material, rock, the weathered rocks of the earth. Mostly, it could be either primary mineral material, which is like just rocks that are broken into smaller pieces by wind and tumbling, or it could be secondary mineral material, which is stuff like clay, which is actually the byproduct of stuff that leached out of the primary material and then recrystallized. So clay is actually a secondary mineral, which is not super important, but it's kind of cool. And then the other solid stuff is the organic matter. And you guys touched on a lot of that, right? The living organisms and the stuff that was living. And when I say organic, it's not USDA organic. It's organic as in it contains carbon, right? But stuff that is alive or was produced by living things. So there's that solid stuff. And then equally as important is what occupies the blank space between the solid stuff, the pore space. So to visualize pore space, the silly analogy I always use is to think about the ball pit at those disgusting ball pits at like Chuck E. Cheese, where the kids play in the plastic balls. The balls would be the solid stuff, and then you can visualize all those empty spaces between the balls. So soil is the same way, more or less. And there's the blank places between the soil are either occupied by water, we call it soil water, or air, which is the gas, the air that's in the soil is slightly different than the air that's above the soil. Tends to be higher in CO2, a little lower in oxygen, but generally the same thing. So those are the physical components of soil right there. And even looking at this chart, you can probably start to think how as gardeners we might manipulate it, right? If we rototill the soil, what are we doing? Just think about it for a second, right? We'd be increasing the portion that is pore space, right? We're fluffing the soil up, the mineral components stayed the same, but there'd be more pore space. Now, rototilling might not be the best way to do that, but it would definitely create more pore space. If we add compost, we're increasing this wedge here, that's organic matter. So if we compact the soil, if we run across it, or your kids trample across it, or your dogs trample across it, we're pushing the soil together, we're squeezing out those pore spaces, and we'd be reducing these top wedges. So something to keep in mind. So while, what I showed you in that first slide was a fairly undisturbed, well-managed Western soil, a lot of landscape soils look different because they're heavily compacted, during landscape, either construction activities or just use, right? Either by foot traffic or by equipment that compacts them to make them, usually intentionally, to make them stronger and better able to bear structures. So, we're usually dealing with this. We have a lot less pore space, and particularly you'll notice a lot less of the large pore spaces that would hold air. It's one of our main challenges in landscape soil. So we're going to talk about today, first, we're going to talk about the physical part of soil, texture, structure, and pore space. We'll talk about compaction, what it is, how we deal with it, and tillage. And then we'll talk a little about soil ecology and soil biology. And if we have time, we'll talk about plant symbiotic microbes right at the end briefly, because it's kind of a hot topic. All right, so first, texture, structure, and pore space. We're going to start with texture. So texture is simply the composition of a given soil by percentage volume of the main soil fines, sand, silt, and clay. We say soil fines because they're the finest parts, the smallest components of the smallest mineral components of soil, right? So sand is the largest of those particles, clay is the smallest, and silt is in between. When we talk about soil texture, those three components always add to 100, right? We don't worry about the other components that might be on there, like gravel. We sieve those out first. So we're just talking about the percentages of sand, silt, and clay that compose the soil. You can see from this picture that the small dot would be clay and the large circle would be a coarse sand. So there's a big difference in particle size between the three. We use the soil texture triangle, which you probably recognize from your class, to describe texture. So if a soil was 40% clay, well, that's not good. Let's say 30% clay, 30% silt. It has to be 40%, it should be, and it is, sand, and that would be classified as a clay loam. The first term in each of these different types, sandy clay, sandy loam, silty clay, whatever the first word is the primary, is the soil fine that gives the primary attribute. So if sandy is first, it behaves primarily like a sandy soil. If clay is first, it behaves primarily like a clay soil. And clay is the soil fine that has the biggest impact on soil properties. It is because of its properties, its size, its structure, it is very powerful. Clay is a secondary mineral. It's recrystallized minerals that leached out of essentially rocks during weathering. Like all soil particles, or most soil particles anyways, it has a strong negative charge on its surface, meaning it can hold things with positive charges. Negative attracts positive, right? Just like magnets. And what really makes clay just so important is how much internal surface area it has. So here's a picture of clay using an electron microscope, and this is a specific type of clay. There are lots of different clay minerals, but this is just one for an example. you can see it's got this platy crystalline structure. So there's all the surface area on the outside of these, and then between these different flakes, there's also surface area. If you were to hold, so what I mean by internal surface area is if you took the clay, if you took the soil particles and you peeled them like oranges and laid them flat, laid those peels, soil peels, so to speak, flat. The area that covered is the would cover is the internal surface area. So for a handful of clay, if you were to take them and peel all the clay particles and lay their surfaces flat, one handful could potentially cover an area as large as a football field, which is just crazy, right? So that's a huge amount of internal surface area to hold water and to hold nutrients. All that surface area has a negative charge. Water molecules have a positive charge on one end and a negative on the other. So the positive end of the water molecule is attracted to the negative the negative surface of the clay particle, and it holds it. We all knew this instinctively, right? Because your clay soil doesn't drain and it holds a bunch of water. The same thing is true for minerals that have a positive charge. They're held on the surface of the clay particle. So we'll talk more about that later. But that mind-blowing internal surface area is why clay has such a powerful effect on soil. And why, when you're looking at this chart, that even soils that have as low as 20% clay have clay in their name somewhere, right? 30% clay, and clay is still the first term in the name, meaning it's the dominant soil fine in terms of determining the soil's properties. So clay soils tend to have that huge amount of internal surface area, and because they're so small, they fit together more tightly. And while there's a lot of pore space, the pore space that is in clay soils tends to be very small, meaning it holds water, and it holds water very tightly. So clay soils tend to have slow water movement, poor drainage. They warm more slowly in the spring because they're holding all that water that has to warm as well. There's more mass that has to warm. They hold a lot. They do hold a lot of nutrients, and they, even though they're holding a lot of the water too tight, they do hold water, making it available for plants. Not all of it's available for plants, of course. So that's clay. And I talked about this, as low as 20% can behave as a clayey soil. Low as 20% clay content. Silt is a slightly larger soil fine. It feels smooth between your fingers if you're feeling your soil. If you wet your soil and rub between your fingers, you'll feel the silt because it feels smooth, like you'd put a drop of lotion on your fingers. It's large enough and heavy enough that it settles out of slowly moving waters like streams, ditch bottoms, lakes. And so it's oftentimes in the bottom of those features. Silt does not have a huge effect on soil properties. And in Colorado, anyway, so here's an electron microscope of silt. You can see it's not crystalline. It's just weathered rocks of the earth broken into smaller pieces by wind and freezing and thawing and, tumbling and all those things. Sand is the largest of the soil fines. It'll feel gritty between your fingers. I didn't, by the way, going back, mention how clay feels, which you probably already know, right? Clay feels sticky, right? And that's all that negative charge being attracted to your skin, sticky. But anyway, so sand will feel gritty, right, between your fingers. It is much larger than silt or clay. It comes in different grades, different sizes, ranging from like fine sand to very coarse sand. We don't care too much about that for the purposes of this course. If you're into golf, golfers, care a lot about the different grades of sand for putting greens and etc. But, we're in this for gardening today. So here you can just see the different sands. There is a huge range in sizes. And here you can see sand under an electron microscope, much bigger than clay. You can see, again, it's just a rock. It's just a rock that's been made very small by various natural forces of weathering. So soils that are dominated by sand because sand particles are larger, the spaces between them tend to be larger. And so they tend to have lots of large pore spaces, which do have a harder time holding water against gravity. They still have a negative charge that attracts water, but there's a lot less surface area than with clay. A handful of sandy soil, if you were to take them and all peel them like orange, take all the sand particles and peel them like oranges and spread them out, would cover an area about the size of a ping pong table opposed to that football field. So it's a huge difference. So that's a lot less negative charge to hold water, to hold nutrients. And on top of that, there's bigger pore spaces between the sand particles, which, you know, they have a harder time holding water against gravity, right? The mass of the water is greater, and so gravity acts on it more strongly and tends to drain the water out of those pores. So because of this, sandy soils tend to drain very rapidly. They tend to be and it makes them droughty and infertile. They don't hold a lot of nutrients. Doesn't mean you can't grow in sand, it just means you got to be aware of that. So that's a very quick run through of soil texture. But when we're thinking about the properties of our soil, it's not just the percentage sand, silt, and clay that give our soil its properties. It's also the size and shapes of the pores between them and that internal surface area that I already mentioned. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I think I got ahead of myself when I talked about it. But generally, water tends to coat soil particles and then fill small pore spaces. In small pore spaces, gravity is not strong enough to pull the water out of those pores, so the water is retained in those pores for plant use, or sometimes it's held so tightly in those pores that plants can't actually even pull it out, like in a very clayey soil. On the other hand, large pores tend to drain of water and be filled with air. And plant roots need oxygen to do respiration, which is the process where plants actually derive energy from sugars. So roots need oxygen. So we do want air in our soil. Just if you want to visualize it, this is how soil particles hold. This looks very sciencey, I know. This is how soil particles hold water. So this square is a soil particle, has a negative charge. This is a water molecule, H2O. The water molecule has a positive charge on one end due to some fancy chemistry regions we won't get into. That's attracted to the negative particle on the negative charge in the soil particle. The other end of the water molecule has a negative charge, which attracts the positive end of another water molecule, and we get this chain of water molecules holding onto the soil surface. That's how soil retains water. It's kind of cool. So all of that has like practical applications, right? So just thinking about pore space and not yet thinking about structure, we have this really kind of famous chart about plant soil water relations. So I spent too much time on this last night. I want to go through it a little quicker today. What we have here on this axis of the graph is inches of water added to a given area of soil, okay? So, and then on the bottom, we have really coarse soils ranging down the scale to very fine clayey soils. So sand coarse ranging to fine clay. Clay small pore sizes, sand large pore sizes. If we were to add that 4 inches of water to a sandy soil, all the water above this first line is what we call gravitational water, meaning it's pulled away by gravity down deeper into the soil where plants can't use it, into water tables, streams, etc. So plants can't use that. It's gone. For our purposes as growers of things, it's wasted water. So if we added 4 inches, most of that would drain away from a sandy soil. But for a clay soil, 1 foot of clay soil, which is what this is saying, can hold almost that full 4 inches of water. And then there's the whole range in between. So almost none of that water would be pulled out by gravity in a clay soil. The line here is labeled field capacity. That's simply the amount of water a soil can hold against gravity. After gravity has drained away that water, we start to go to the water that's available to plants. So plants use that water, maybe some evaporates from the soil surface, it's being depleted, until we reach this ominously labeled bottom line, which is titled permanent wilting point, which is a fancy way of saying the point at which plants die. So in a sandy soil, it's about a 1/2 inch of water between the first line where gravity drained water away and the second line where plants can no longer get water out. About a 1/2 inch that sandy soils can hold for plant use. For a loamy soil, and loam is a term that confuses people, but it's just a soil that has a good mix of sand, silt, and clay particles. For a loamy soil, it looks like we have 2.5 or more inches of water that are available for plant use. In a clay soil, maybe 1.5 inches that are in between the two lines. So, that's pretty interesting, right? And if you're into agronomy or you're growing plants in a very in any kind of like commercial setting, you really care about stuff like this, right? And generally what your management routine is that once half the plant available water for your type of soil is depleted, you irrigate back up to field capacity. So for a loamy soil, you'd let about 1.25 inches be used. You can figure that out using meteorological data. You would add another 1.5 inches back. You wouldn't add more because, again, that would be wasted. The last part of this is you'll notice below that line, the permanent wilting point line, there still is some water in the soil. That is unavailable water that is held in small pores too tightly for most plants to use. And so you see for a clay soil, it's a lot of water that's held in too tightly in small pores, unavailable to use. For a sandy soil, it's very little. So I just put that in here to show you guys there is practical applications of this, right? And if you knew what soil type you have, you could kind of make references about or guesses about how much you should be adding, water you should be adding. I already talked about internal surface area, but I have this slide in here so you can see how as soil particle size decreases, say sand to clay, how internal surface area increases, right? Instead of just the, the outside of this square, now if we would say this was sand, with clay, we have that same surface area on the outside, but we have all this other surface area to the inside. And the smaller the particles got, the more internal surface area you would get. So clay has much more than sand. And that explains a lot, as I've already said, about how soil behaves, how it holds water and nutrients. Okay, so this part here is something that's a little bit higher level, and I'm going to spend like 2 or 3 minutes on it just to introduce it to you, because you're all here in a science course seeking knowledge. I don't want to shy away from it, but I also don't want to dwell on it too much. But I just want to say just one word about cation exchange capacity. Okay, so a lot of things on this picture, but the thing I want you to notice is that we have soil particles here, clay, for example, a clay soil. This one represents a clay soil, and this one represents a sandy loam soil, so a more sandy soil. You'll see the negative charges on the clay and the negative charges on the sandy loam. They both have that, but a clay soil has, hypothetically, it does have more negative charge, right? Which means that it can hold more nutrients of various types with positive charges. Calcium, sodium, there's hydrogen, magnesium. It can hold more of those. The sandy loam has less of a negative charge, so it can hold less nutrients, right? So we call that ability, we measure that negative charge with this term called cation exchange capacity. So it's the measurement of the amount of negative charge a soil has. And conversely, it's the measurement of the amount of ions or nutrients, if you want to think about it that way, or water, with the positive charge that soil can hold. And that's important to us because here you have a list, right? Most plant nutrients have a positive charge. So it's that negative charge on the surface that gives soil the ability to hold these things. Clays have a high cation exchange capacity. Organic matter has a very high cation exchange capacity due to its chemical properties and due to their surface area. Another electron microshot of clay here, you can see all that surface area between these platy crystals that can hold nutrients. On the other hand, sand, gravel, those sorts of things tend to have a low cation exchange capacity. That's why sandy soils tend to be infertile. The way I would think about this is sandy soil is like a big basket for nutrients. It can hold, is a small basket for nutrients. You fill it up, so when you're filling it with your fertilizer or whatever, you don't want to overfill it. So you'd add a smaller amount of fertilizer or nutrients, however you're adding them, to a sandy soil. A clay soil is like a big basket. It can hold a lot of nutrients. You can load it up, and then it kind of can be more slowly emptied. That's not a perfect analogy, but I think it kind of gets the point home. Good growers can grow in sand or clay. It's just they know how to manage plants growing in those soils. Okay, so here's where I'm going to open up the chat again, just briefly, just kind of like a thinking, like a thought exercise. I'm going to open it up, but first I'm going to ask the question. So here we have right here, NO3 negative, the most common and easily absorbed form of nitrogen in soils. And nitrogen is one of the 3 main plant nutrients. So I'm going to open up the chat And what I want you to do is, put what you notice about it, and then put what the implication of that is to you, right? Compared to the other other plant nutrients we just looked at. So I just opened up chat. So what do you notice about nitrogen, and then what do you think the implications of that might be to us as gardeners? You can just type a sentence if you want. So I'm seeing negative charge, negative charge, negative charge, so it doesn't bond to the negative charge on soil surface. So you guys are getting it. Okay, so I think you guys are all getting it pretty much. It's not so much about the oxygen, those who are putting it, right? It's the negative charge. You guys, I think almost everyone's putting that in there, right? And then I think I see a lot of people starting to put the implications of that in, right? So if it has a negative charge and soil surfaces have a negative charge, so if you put two similar ends of a magnet together, what do? Repel each other, right? So it's just like that, negative on the soil surface, negative on the nitrogen, they repel each other. So the implications of that are soil cannot hold the common form of mineral nitrogen that plants need, right? So what happens to that nitrogen? It either leaches or it's used by plants, right? So nitrogen does not stick around in the soil. That's the big implication. I think you guys were all mostly getting that. So that means we manage nitrogen differently than, say, nutrients that have positive charge the soil can hold. That's why nitrogen is so important. It's the number one limiting nutrient for plant growth, because it doesn't stick around and doesn't stick around in systems. And I see lots of great stuff coming in, doesn't stick in soil, doesn't stay in soil, doesn't stick to the soil. All of that is correct. So I'm going to close chat now. Thank you guys for participating in that. I'm going to minimize that. Okay. Oops. Oh my gosh, I went way too far ahead. Things you guys won't even see. We're not going to talk about compost. I'm going to break your hearts. We're not going to do that. Okay. So, and you guys got it. It had nice negative charge, just like soil surfaces. Implication is that soil cannot hold it. So, and here's just a list of implications, right? Soil does not hold that much. The final part of it I didn't mention is that nitrogen can be stored in organic form. So again, just to use an analogy, like in our bodies, in our DNA and in our cell walls, there's a lot of nitrogen, but it's bound up in complex mineral form or complex forms that plants can't use. But that's okay. So when you add compost, you're adding plant bodies and such to your soil. There is nitrogen in that in complex forms. It'll be stored in those until microbes break it down and make it available for plants. So if you're doing organic gardening or trying to manage your nitrogen by adding organic, or trying to manage your nutrients by adding organic matter, the organic matter will be your kind of battery, your storage bank for nitrogen that'll again slowly be released by soil microbes. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So the question all this leads to is how do you tell what type of soil you have? Before I talk about this, this was in your online or your Canvas portion of this course, how to do this jar test. I want to say when you talk to your clients, probably lots of times you're not going to be instructing them to do a jar test. You're going to be instructing them to get a soil test done. In which, the basic procedure is that as you take a soil sample from the area you care about, and you're going to submit it to a soil lab to have them analyze it. CSU has a soil lab on campus you can mail samples to. It's very affordable. It's $35 or $36 to have a sample looked at. I think my colleagues will post a link to that in the chat as well for you to look at. But the basic procedure is you want to, for the rooting depth of your plants, which, if it's a lawn, it might be shallower, but somewhere between 6 and 18 inches, whatever the rooting depth for your plants is, you want to take a good representative soil sample of that depth. So either use a soil probe, which would be the easy way. You push it in and it pulls at a core. You'd collect, anywhere from, 3 to 9 or maybe more, depending if it's large area samples. Mix them up in a 5-gallon bucket and then scoop your sample out of that to get a good representative sample. Or the less, if you don't have a fancy soil probe, you would dig a hole to the depth of your rooting zone for your plants. You scrape the side up. You then take your shovel and scrape the side of that hole all the way to the bottom. and then take what you scraped, put that in a 5-gallon bucket, do that several times in your area, and then mix that together and scoop your sample out of that. That's the basic way if you're submitting a sample to a lab. But for if you want to do a kind of the quickish and dirtyish test, you can either do this test by feel, which was in your Canvas portion of the course, where you feel the soil between your fingers and make a ribbon by squirting it out of your hand. The longer ribbon it is, the more sticky it is, the more clayey it is. The smoother it feels, shorter ribbon would make it silty, or if it won't form a ribbon and feels gritty, you have some sort of sandy soil. So that's the feel test. That's a kind of a fun one to do. Or you could do this jar test, where you take a jar, you fill it about a quarter full with soil, fill it up with water, add dishwashing or other non-foaming detergent to it to help the clay particles deflocculate or separate, and then shake, shake, shake. Oh gosh, I did it again. It's a horrible habit. And then shake, 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 shake until it, 10 to 15 minutes, probably longer, to be honest. My personal advice is pay a small person, child or grandchild in your life to shake it. And the more you shake it, the better the results will be. And then you set it down and let it settle. Because sand particles are larger and heavier, they'll settle out first, followed by silt, followed by clay. And so you'll get these layers in the soil or in your sample after shaking. You can mark those layers on the jar. Technically, sand should settle out about a minute. Silt should take 2 hours, and clay will take days to settle out. You then measure the relative depths of those layers. Do them as proportions of your total depth to get the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. Plug those into your soil texture triangle, and boom, you can figure out what soil texture you have. So there's more on that in the Canvas portion. That's just the brief summary of it. So here's the question I have to you. And again, I think I'm going to open up chat, and I just want to see simple yeses and nos. Oh gosh, I gave it away. You didn't see that. It didn't happen. Can you add sand to a clay soil to change its texture? All right, so I'm gonna open this up to everybody. Simple yes or no. Can you change your soil texture by adding sand to a clay soil? Okay, mostly no's, a few yeses, a yes with a question mark. I like it. That's how I feel about most things these days. Nope, nope, yeah, okay. Since the answer's still coming in, so I'll let it go for a second longer. But mostly no's, a few yeses. No question mark. Okay, I'll give you just a second more. I think most of you have already voted. I see don't know. I like the honesty. All right, I'm gonna close the chat. I see depends. More soil replacement. Yeah. Yeah, okay. All right, I'm gonna close the chat. Okay, so I think most of you said no, and the people who said no were technically correct. It is not practical to change your soil texture by adding sand for a couple of reasons. First, you have to add so much sand to a clay soil to move the needle on this chart that it's effectively soil replacement, right? Your soil volume is going to change by some ridiculous amount, like 30% or more. So if you are modifying 12 inches of soil, you might raise the soil depth by 4 inches, trying to change its texture. And even if you could practically do that, there are other considerations. Adding a bunch of sand doesn't take into account soil structure or the arrangement of soil particles. So what often will happen is if you add a bunch of sand and then irrigate, the disturbed the disturbed clay particles, when you irrigate, will settle between the sand particles, creating very dense and nearly or impermeable or completely impermeable layers in the soil that oxygen can't move through or water won't drain through, because the clay settles in tightly between the sand particles instead of forming a more productively aggregated structure. The other thing is that in a lot of Colorado soils, we have a lot of calcium carbonate or free lime in our soils just due to the factors that went into their formation. And if you've ever made cement, you know that water, sand, and calcium lime are some of the big 3 components. And so in soils that contain a lot of free lime, you can almost get kind of rock-like layers forming in them at the edge of where water leaches to. So we don't recommend adding sand to a clay soil. It's one of those big gardening myths that a lot of people believe, but we don't recommend it. If you add a little sand, it's probably not going to make a huge problem. It's when you add a lot of sand that it makes a problem, and a little sand wouldn't achieve any benefit, right? So, so no. Hang on, I got a good clip. So no, you should not add sand to a clay soil to fix it. When you're if you're going to be a master gardener, when you're talking to your clients about this, oftentimes what you'll get is that they've already added sand to their clay soil, and they'll tell it to you proudly, or say, "I've already dealt with my clay by adding some sand." In which case, the correct response is not to tell them they were stupid. The correct response is just to, tell them to add organic matter and, not to add any more sand. So anyways, there's normally no practical way to change your soil texture. What you have is what you're stuck with. It's depressing, except we can affect soil structure. So soil structure is how the soil particles are arranged. Texture is just the numerical percentage of what sort of soil particles we have. Soil structure is how they're grouped and stacked together. And we can affect that, and it can make our crummy clayey soils behave more like a nice loamy soil. So this is a really good picture I stole from the internet. You can see how structure would improve soil, or having a good structure would improve a soil, right? You've got teeny pores between some of these aggregates of soil. You've got big pores between the larger aggregates that drain and are filled with oxygen. And again, you have these kind of intermediate pores that may hold water against gravity in a way that plants, but in a loose way that plants can access. So well aggregated soil is like magic. Like, it makes our clay soil behave more like a loamy soil. It makes our sandy soil hold more nutrients and water. I already said this. Again, structure is the arrangement of soil particles, where texture is just the size of soil particles. In nature, there are a whole range, natural soils, there are a whole range of soil structures, from nice granular soils like they have in the Midwest to platy soils like some clay soils form. In landscapes, we tend to have compacted soils, which have a soil structure that resembles like what is called in natural soils a massive soil structure, which is a structure with, is a soil with almost no structure. And we want to improve them to make them behave more like a blocky or even a granular soil. So soil structure takes time to develop. You can get structure, it's not going to happen in 1 year, but it will happen in years, right? Not decades, or in your garden anyways, not in decades or centuries or something. It happens in years. So essentially the first thing that happens is plant roots, maybe you're growing through the soil, they push soil particles a little closer together. They cause clay particles to stick together. We call that flocculate. It's a fun word to say. And form like these little groups of clay minerals. The roots live, die, microbes are in there decomposing them. Along the course of their lives, all the roots and the microbes release essentially what are just sticky substances, either sugars or long sticky proteins, etc., that cause those groups of clay particles maybe to stick to hunks of dead organic matter, or to sand, or to other clay particles. And so you get this hierarchy of aggregates forming with those clay particles grouped together, sticking to other things. And then those things that form a larger aggregate, which then sticks to other larger aggregates. And you get that whole hierarchy of structure forming that I showed you in the first slide. I should go back. So this is the first year. I used to live at this house in Erie, Colorado, and it was pretty much pure clay when I moved in. And this was the first year right after I amended. You can see the organic matter in there, the darker color. You can see what happened when I squeezed that soil, right? It's like potter's clay. I could have made mugs from it or something. This is after, I think this is the third of amending. So again, I've got a ball of that soil and I squeezed it. And here you can see that the soil has started to aggregate, right? When I squeeze it, it breaks up into different aggregates. It's not just a block of clay all stuck together anymore. Now we've got these aggregates which have formed, creating that kind of, if you want to put it in a simple way, looser structure, better aerated, more plant available water. And again, one last picture, I don't want to dwell on it, but you can see like the small particles stuck together with little teeny pores between them. The smaller particles form an aggregate though. Between them is kind of medium-sized pore spaces where maybe water is held that plants are used. All those medium-sized aggregates group together, forming larger aggregates that have larger pore spaces between them. And that's the magic of it, right? When your soil aggregates, when structure starts to form, it'll behave like a soil that has a good mix of pore space sizes and be easier to grow in. Little plants will be less prone to problems. So the take-home message from all this is that clay soils tend to hold a lot of water and nutrients, but they are poorly draining. A lot of that water is not available. They have low soil oxygen. So our management plan is to add organic matter to encourage better aeration. And when we water them, we water and fertilize them. We water and fertilize them less often with larger amounts of water and fertilizer. For sandy soils, they have poor aeration, or they have really good aeration, sorry, but they have poor water holding and poor nutrient holding capacities. So we add organic matter to improve those things. And we fertilize and water with smaller amounts of fertilizer and water so as not to waste either of the two things. So I'm going a little slow, so I'm going to skip just a little ahead here, or I'm just talking too much. It's also the option. Believe it or not, I pared this down from last night. So I want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking about soil biology, ecology, and organic matter, because I think it's the other thing that is really important to understand how soils work. So I'm going to talk about this, and then we're just going to essentially open up the last 20 minutes of the class, 25 minutes of the class for Q&A, and I'll answer questions about the course material that you guys did on your own in Canvas or about any of this. So that's our plan here. So of all the things that I lecture about in my role with Extension, soil biology is one of my just favorite things to talk about because it is so fascinating. There's so much we don't know about the life in the soil underneath our feet. There's so much going on. It's just, to me, it's really interesting. The soil below your feet as you're walking has this complex web of organisms in it, which are living a variety of crazy lives, doing crazy things, feeding on each other, feeding on organic matter, being fed on by larger things like birds and soil-dwelling animals. But you'll notice on this chart, the basis of the whole soil food web is organic matter, right? Originally, that's usually created by plants, which are, doing photosynthesis and fixing carbon from the atmosphere. That's the basis of the whole food web, is right. So they die, they're part of the soil organic matter pool, which is fed on by bacteria, fungi, nematodes. Those things are fed on by insects, other arthropods like mites, other arthropods like mites. Maybe they're fed upon by other like fungi feeding nematodes, protozoa, other single cell organisms, which are in turn fed by larger arthropods. And then again, it's just crazy. And I don't have time to do it justice in this hour-and-a-half course, but this is all happening under your feet. And the important part is the basis of this whole healthy food chain is organic matter. And if you don't have it, you're going to have a different sort of ecology going on in your soil. If you have it, you will encourage a healthy soil ecology, which will do a number of things for you. One, it ensures that when you have a diverse soil ecology, it ensures that no one soil organism is too prominent, and that includes pathogens and parasites. So you tend to suppress pathogens and parasites in soils where you have a healthy ecology because all those niches are occupied by other things. Another thing that tends to happen in those soils is that, as we talked about, soil organic matter, you can probably hear my son. I'm going to tell him to leave 1 second. Hey, Otto, can you play the different room? Thank you. Sorry, Zoom. He's very sweet. So anyways, is that soil ecology, soil life is what creates soil structure, right? Like those secondary binding agents, those sticky things that help soil particles aggregate are created by life. So having a healthy soil ecology is how you get good soil structure, part of how you get good soil structure. The soil ecology is also cycling nutrients, right? It's taking those complex forms of nutrients, again, in plant bodies and things like that, and making them and mineralizing them, turning them into simple plant available forms. And that's a very important that's very important for us as growers of plants. Finally, a thing that sometimes I talk about more, but today I'm just going to talk about briefly. The end product of decay is the stable end product of decay is a substance we call humus. It's essentially stuff that is too complex to be easily broken down. It's very dark in color. It holds a lot of water. It holds a lot of nutrients. It helps stabilize soil pH. It does a lot of good things for us as gardeners. So we like when a healthy soil ecology is processing that organic matter and creating humus. It takes a while to build up in your soil, to have it build up in soils that don't maintain a lot of it, or don't contain a lot of it. But anyways, those are the main benefits us as gardeners. There's also a lot of ecosystem services that are performed by soil life, like purifying water, degradation of pesticides, breaking pesticides down to simpler forms that aren't as environmentally toxic, and then carbon capture. Again, as this humus accumulates, so does carbon in the soil. So that helps actually mitigate some of the carbon in the atmosphere that leads to global warming, climate change, things like that. I usually show a lot of pictures of soil life, but I just want to show you this one because it's the craziest one to me. So we have two things in this picture, two organisms. We have this fungi that has created these hoops, right? This is a fungi. And then we have a type of fungi. Then we have this other organism, which is a nematode. So this is actually a predatory fungus that has evolved to snare nematodes in those hoops and then kind of pull them in, entomb them, and digest them to drive energy from their bodies. Pretty crazy, right? Like weird science fiction sort of stuff. So soil life is fascinating, and I could talk about it more, but we don't really have time for it today. Again, just to drive it home, as gardeners, the part of this we really control is the organic matter content. We want to supply the food. We want to make sure that there is a healthy amount of organic matter, not too much, in our soil. We also want to make sure there's good aeration and good moisture. And it's a lucky coincidence that the conditions that are right for plant growth are generally the same conditions that are optimal for healthy soil ecology. It's almost like these things evolve together in nature, right? So anyways, Kevin Costner here. Maybe this reference is getting too old, but Field of Dreams, right? Build it and they will come. That is generally the rule for soil life, right? Create the right conditions, supply the organic matter, and the rest of it will take care of itself. Microbes are very good at colonizing things. If conditions are right, the right kind of microbes are probably going to be there in an outdoor, in-ground soil system. So the last piece about this is just a little more of a deep dive into what soil organic matter is. I've already said that organic matter is not like USDA organic, right? That's a human made up definition. Organic matter in this context is a chemical definition. It's organic as in contains carbon. It's the remains of decomposing living things in the various states of decay. It's the soil organisms, and it's also the things that are created along the way. So those sticky secondary binding agents would be one example of the things that are created along the way. A lot of soil organisms also just kind of lose sugar into the soil solution. So that's another thing you might find. If you're dealing with a well-developed soil, your composition of your soil organic matter will look something like this. About 10% of it will be the fresh residue. That's stuff that still looks like what it was when it was living, right? It has not been decomposed very much. 30 to 50% will be the rapidly decomposing organic matter. We call that the active fraction. It's going to be decomposed in weeks or months, like a growing season is about your time frame for that. That's where nutrients are mostly being released from by microbes. It starts to look just like decomposing organic matter. Like think about leaves as they decompose, opposed to like looking like a leaf. It looks like kind of like brown, and you might still see some bits of leaves, but it's already decomposing down into its component parts. Sorry. You will have about 30 to 50% stabilized organic matter. That's your humus. It takes time to build that up, right? You won't have that the first year if you're dealing with a soil that started with low organic matter, but that's about what it'll stabilize at over time if you're consistently adding organic matter to the soil. And then about 5% living organisms. That's the microbes, the roots, other things that are still alive in the soil. And this chart, we'll spend too much time on this if I'm not careful, but this chart explains a lot about why first year organic gardeners and organic farmers struggle. Because it takes a while to get to this percentage. When you add manure or compost manure to your garden, you're adding mostly stuff in these two categories, the green and purple category. And it may, all the nutrients, there may be a burst of nutrients released from this stuff at the start, and then it may taper off dramatically. And so unless you're adding a fertilizer after that initial release, you're very prone to nutrient deficiencies and low yields in the first couple years. Now, as you're adding every year, manure, compost, you start accumulating this fraction that more slowly releases nutrients. And you get other, things that are kind of between these two fractions that are releasing nutrients in kind of the midterm. So you get more stable release of nutrients over the course of the growing season as you've been adding organic matter repetitively. But again, it's why oftentimes first year organic farmers, they're getting all their nutrients from compost or manure. Compost and manure would be another option. Struggle. Just a little side note. And the big take-home message of all this for me is that all the benefits, all the magic we get by adding organic matter occur as it's decomposed. It is not the organic matter in most cases that gives us the benefits. It's what happens to that organic matter as it is processed by soil life. This takes time. And that's an important thing to understand as gardeners. If you are adding organic matter, it is not a magic solution. It's not, taking a pill to get rid of your headache, right? Where it happens pretty quickly. It's something that it takes time. It's not adding Miracle-Gro, which provides nitrogen immediately. Nothing wrong with that in my opinion. But anyways, if you do it correctly. But it's something that, it takes time and it takes patience, right? The humus is created over time. Structure is formed over time. All that stuff, happens gradually. So just something that I thought might be helpful when talking to your clients, what some terms mean. So this gets really confused when we talk about soil, right? I already mentioned organic means containing carbon. An amendment is something which is mixed into the soil. It could be compost, it could be composted manure, it could be fresh manure, it could be baseballs, right? It's something that we mix into the soil. Mulch is something which is placed on the surface of the soil, and compost simply means decomposing organic matter. It could be decomposing vegetable scraps from your kitchen. It could be decomposing manure. Anything that is decomposing is composting and is thus compost. Some really tricky ones are the term topsoil. So technically, from a soil scientist's mind, topsoil usually means the top, one of the top horizons of soil that's high in organic matter, the A horizon. Your course talked about this. But in the landscaping industry, topsoil is an unregulated term. It can mean almost anything. It's just a marketing term. So don't assume that just because you're buying topsoil, it's some scraped off A horizon that's rich in organic matter. It may or may not be that. Potting soil generally means a product that's designed for use in containers and normally contains no actual soil. It's all organic matter, peat moss. These days, it feels like a lot of potting soil has a lot of wood chips in it, which I'm not super fond of. Maybe perlite, vermiculite, things like that. A fertilizer is a product which contains a guaranteed minimum amount of plant nutrients. That's in your course. That's a legal term, right? It's defined by law that it has to contain what's on the label at least. And manure is animal excrement, right? It can be a variety of animals, but you all know what that means. So, okay, we're doing pretty good on time. We're just about done. This is right where I wanted to be for this little review, and then we'll do Q&A. I want to put this thought in your head because I don't have time to talk about all this in depth. But I want you to think about just a little bit here, and I'm just going to give you like 30 seconds on your own to just puzzle through it a little bit, and then we'll talk about it. Where organic matter comes from in different systems. We have 3 systems here, right? A farm growing corn, right? Here we have a forest in Utah, beautiful forest. And here we have a landscape, just a basic landscape, turf. I guess, turf. It could be, flower garden that's going to go in there, whatever. But where organic matter comes from those different systems and how it moves. Just maybe think about it in your head, 10, 15 seconds each system. And then we'll talk about it and why I think it's important. Okay, so hopefully you got some ideas in your head. Let's talk about it. In this forest system, a natural, so to speak, system, organic matter is cycled every year within the system, right? The leaves on these trees all are going to fall to the ground, start being decomposed, and be added back to the soil. Maybe animals eat them. They move through the animal, but the organic matter that comes out, so to speak, still stays in the system, right? Every year, some nitrogen is added to the system by lightning strikes, weathering. Maybe it's enters the system through weathering rocks, and some leaves through leaching. But essentially, it's a fairly closed system, right, where organic matter cycles. We obviously are not, dealing with that in a landscape setting, but there are some similarities there. Maybe you noticed. In an agricultural setting, which is somewhat similar to your vegetable garden, how does organic matter move through this system, right? So what's he adding in this picture? Manure, right? That's a manure spreader. So he's growing corn or sheep. The farmer's growing corn. The corn is harvested. So what's happening to organic matter and nutrients in that system? When they harvest it, the organic matter is leaving the system, right? It's being fed, in this case, it's cow corn, being fed to cows. Those cows are being hypothetically harvested for their milk or for their meat. Maybe they're being milked too, sorry, for their meat, and nutrients that were in the organic, in the organic matter are leaving the system that way. Now, some of the nutrients may be going back into the system if the cow's manure is captured and then spread back on the field. But ultimately, some nutrients are leaving the system because we're consuming them in the form of the meat. So some are probably going to be added back in the form of fertilizer or some other method. Your vegetable garden would be similar to this, right? There's no free ticket. When you pull the vegetables out of the garden and eat them, right, that is nutrients leaving the system, that is organic matter leaving the system, and you're going to have to get some extra nutrients or organic matter somehow, whether it's fertilizer or compost you buy, and add them back to the system, right, to keep it at a productive level. That'd be the vegetable garden portion of your landscape. If you're growing turf, is that a closed system? It's kind of an interesting question, right? If you're leaving your grass clippings on the lawn, I guess it's somewhat closed, right? In fact, if you leave your clippings, you can reduce your fertilizer needs by about 30%, but you still are going to have to fertilize turf if you want to get optimal looking turf, if that's something that matters to you. So a good example of this is tree leaves, right? So, if every year, here you have the leaves that fell off these trees, they've been arranged on the street to be picked up by this street sweeper. The nutrients were taken up into the trees, bound up in the leaves. The leaves fell off while still containing most of those nutrients. The plants recoup some of them. And then this is potential soil organic matter, but instead it's being lost and taken to the landfill or the city composting facility or whatever. If the leaves have been on the grass and just mulched in, that organic matter would be, a lot of it anyways, would be recouped by the system. So it's just kind of interesting to think about when you're managing these systems. But the baseline thing is, and your course covered this in more detail, so I'm just going to give you the short run through. The goal is to have 5% organic matter in your soil. More than that, and too many nutrients will be released each year for plants to use, and they may be leached into groundwater, et cetera, and your soil may hold too much water. That 5% will give you enough nutrients for most plants that you want to grow. It'll give you enough, it'll help improve your soil structure. It'll improve your soil water holding capacity. We build up to that 5% gradually as to get a good mix of those different wedges of organic matter types we talked about in our pie chart. either by adding amendments, so adding organic matter in the form of compost, or by management practices like mulching in our clippings off from our lawnmower or our leaves. Adding wood mulch to the surface of soil and perennial beds also improves organic matter content below. And so let's see. Yeah, so I'm about the time I wanted to cut this off, and this is about what I wanted to get through. I want to show you one more chart because I think as Master Gardener volunteers or in the industry working with clients, this is something good to know. This is our recommendations for adding compost to the garden. So if it's a plant-based compost, those tend to be lower in salts. So we can add, if it's a first application, 2 to 3 inches, and maybe over time, as we build up organic matter in the soil, reduce that to 1 or 2 inches of plant-based compost. If it's a manure-based compost, because they're higher in salts and we don't want to nuke the plant, so to speak, we don't add too much salts, add enough salts to make it hard, add too much salt, make it hard for plants to grow. We maybe just add an inch of manure, or probably less. Talking to experts, this is what our fact sheet said. It's probably less, and over time, it's probably even less than this 1 inch. But and this amounts to 1 cubic yard per 1,000 square feet. This is 2 to 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. So anyways, that's our recommendation. I think it's something to know. This is in a fact sheet that CSU Extension has on our website, so you don't have to keep it in your head. You can find the fact sheet when you need to get the information to somebody out there. If we have time and there's not a lot of questions, I'm going to come back to this slide. But what I think I want to do now with 20 minutes left is open up our discussion to questions through the Q&A feature. I think you guys have already been submitting some.
Yeah, Eric. So what we've been doing is we've been answering these in the background. We're going to go ahead and start answering them, copying and pasting our answers to all these into the questions they've already submitted. Go ahead and submit more questions if you have them, but just know if you've already submitted one, we're going to be putting the answer to that up right now and moving it over to the answered column. So
Okay.
yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, cool. So are there some of these that you want me to answer, Amy, or?
There was one that we did not answer, maybe even a couple. Can you explain again, does the clay have more negative charge because it has the higher surface area? That was one of those questions that came in.
Sure, yeah. So clay has more negative charge for 2 reasons. One, the simplest reason is it has more surface area, right? More surface area that has a negative charge, so it all adds up to more, right? That football field versus the ping pong table analogy. The other thing is that the other reason clay has a stronger negative charge has to do with the structure of clay minerals. And different clay minerals actually have different strengths of negative charge based on the structure of their crystalline structure and what minerals are involved in that. And that is super boring, and you do not need to know that as gardeners 100%. But that structure is different than sand, so that's also what gives it a little bit more negative charge. But the primary reason for us as gardeners is to think about is that greater amount of internal surface area. Yeah.
Great. And then I think there was one more. Let me just get this pasted.
The other one was, what have you been amending in your Erie garden? What exactly did you use to amend?
Sure. So when you're talking about different types of amendments, that's like a whole hour talk, but the baseline of that is if you're adding any sort of organic matter back, you're doing the right thing, right? As long as you're not adding too much of a manure-based product and adding too much salts to the system. The key thing is you're adding organic matter back. In my case, I was buying bagged plant-based compost, which at the time there was a brand of plant-based compost available at the big box stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, which was made from collecting vegetable scraps from big business campuses. And that's what I was buying because I didn't have my own compost. I also could have been buying composted manure and adding that. I just would have added it in lower quantities, or composting my kitchen scraps if I had time to do that. And I could create enough. It's hard to create enough compost from your kitchen scraps for a large garden, but that would be another option, is making your own home compost and adding that back. But again, 2 to 3 inches of plant-based compost, 1 inch and probably less of manure or manure-based compost. You could also do fancier things like grow a cover crop and turn that in. That's a lot of work. Do your research before you get involved in that. Nothing wrong with it. I'm all for it, but it just make sure you know what you're getting into before you do cover crops as a home gardener.
Hey, Eric, we've had a few questions that came in recently about the carbon nitrogen ratio and why it's important. Maybe you could explain that in a little more depth.
Sure. I cut that out of this talk because I was worried I'd ramble on about it for too long, but I have a slide I'll show you guys up here about that. I have a couple slides here. Let me unhide them and I'll show you the slides and we'll talk about it real quick. So carbon to nitrogen ratio is just the relative amounts of carbon and nitrogen that are in something that usually we're putting in our soil or our compost pile. Some things are, if they have a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's, things like wood chips, usually sawdust. They take a very long time to decompose and a relatively long time anyways to decompose and be added, the nutrients that are in them to be added back to the system. If they have a very, very low carbon nitrogen ratio, like on this chart here, you can see biosolids. Oops. You can see biosolids have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. They behave almost like a fertilizer. The nitrogen in them is almost immediately available for plant use or within a month or two. It's made of a big proportion of it's made available. And you can kind of see the range here. Now, if we're adding something to our garden, ideally we want a carbon to nitrogen ratio less than 20. And that's because if the carbon to nitrogen ratio is higher than that, we get this situation going on. Carbon is actually the most limiting nutrient nutrient for soil life. When you add a bunch of it to the system, what happens is, so in this case, we've added a bunch of carbon is what's going on in this graph. Our microbial population, when we add a bunch of carbon, booms. It goes crazy, which might seem like a good thing. But what ends up happening is that as the microbial population booms, they take up all the nitrogen in the system and bind it up in their bodies. They use it in their cell walls, their DNA, et cetera, and make it unavailable for plants to use. So adding a high carbon to nitrogen ratio amendment like sawdust or wood chips is undesirable in the short to medium term, because it leads to soil nitrogen being bound up, and it can lead to depressed plant growth, nitrogen deficiencies in our plants. Eventually, the microbes work through all that carbon and their population crashes, and the nutrients that were in their bodies are released back into the system. And in a Colorado soil, that if you added a bunch of sawdust or wood chips, it could take years for the nitrogen depression to kind of go away and for all the nitrogen that was tied up in the microbial population to be released back into the system. The fix to this, if you've done it or if a client's done it, is relatively easy. You just add a nitrogen fertilizer to compensate for the deficiency. And that will also help the microbes work through the carbon quicker and alleviate the problem quicker. That was my whirlwind discussion of carbon to nitrogen ratio. Oops. So hopefully that answered the question. I'm looking at.
I think so. There was a couple other questions that came in, several about potting soils and how to choose a good one and what's different and why isn't it soil. So there's a few around that topic.
Okay. Sure. Let's talk about potting soils just a little bit. I don't have a slide on that, but let's just talk about it for a second. So generally, if you buy a bagged, potting soil, there is no actual soil in that. It is all organic matter. And it is organic matter that should be fairly stable, fairly slow decomposing, like peat moss, which is a fine media for plant growth, unlike pure compost or something like that. Potting soils tend to be very light, so they have a lot of pore space. They have a lot of pore space that, they're designed, if they're good potting soil, to have pore space that holds water and other pore spaces that drain and are filled with air. So they're designed to be well aerated. They oftentimes add vermiculite or perlite to them, which are minerals that are poofy minerals that have pore spaces in them that, tend to hold a lot of air or water. But again, they contain no mineral, they contain no rather rocks of the earth, right? That mineral component of soil is not in most potting soils. It's too heavy. It doesn't bag well, right? All the soil structure is disturbed when you bag it, so they tend to be really dense. If you bag actual soil, it tends to be really dense and really heavy, and not a great media for plant growth. So Picking a good potting soil is very difficult. The best I can recommend is finding a good brand that you like. If you order a bale of commercial potting soil like SunGrow or one of the other commercial potting soils, it's probably going to be more consistent year to year than the stuff that's bagged for homeowners. I mean, I've bought 2 bags of potting soil in the same pile from the same brand, and I swear they were different. Cassie can relate to this because we've talked about it. Like, one year it'll be great, the next year it smells like manure and is, I think, too hot for
I bought a plant-based one that smelled like chicken poop.
Yeah. So there's very little regulation of all that. So in terms of finding a good one, find a brand you like, hope it stays consistent, or buy a commercial one. You'll have a lot more consistency buying the commercial bales, either from a horticulture supply store, or sometimes even the Home Depot and Lowe's have those commercial bales of potting soil that you can buy from them. Like, again, the big national brand is SunGrow, but there are others. The other thing about potting soil is we don't generally recommend reusing it year to year because it is all organic matter. It's decomposing all the time. And so it's not going to be the same year to year. If you're trying to save a buck, you can like take half of your previous year's potting soil and mix it with new potting soil. But again, best practice would be taking that potting soil and putting it in your compost bin and letting it decompose and adding it back to your garden in the future, or otherwise just not reusing it. Especially if your plants have disease issues, do not reuse your potting soil.
And when does a raised bed become a pot?
When did the raised bed become a pot? I love that question.
Yeah, like when do you kind of consider what you're amending and putting in and filling a raised bed with versus a different kind of pot?
Yeah, so raised beds is another topic I didn't talk about in here because, again, it's a big topic. But the short story is, if you were growing vegetables in a big raised bed garden, I would not be filling them with potting soil. First of all, I'd fill them with either native soil or like some topsoil or something that you order from a landscape supply company. If your raised bed is a short raised, first of all, you get all the same benefits regardless of how deep your raised bed is. If it's, as long as it's more than a few inches, you get all the same benefits. So how deep it is really up to you. If you want to be able to sit on the edge or something like that for your back, to spare your back, or whatever. But if you're putting in a deep raised bed because you want to be able to sit on the edge, keep in mind most of your vegetables root 12 to 18 inches in Colorado. So you want to have the bed be at least that deep and probably deeper to allow for some drainage and maybe some water to pool at the bottom of it. You want to have it probably be deeper than that. I would say, so it never really, if it's deep enough, essentially it's just a big pot filled with soil, but you still want to treat it like soil. You still want to fill it with soil and then treat it like soil, adding compost every year to it, turning that in, etc. I would not be filling it, even if it's a pot-like situation, I'd not be filling it with potting soil because, one, it's going to be super expensive, and two, that potting soil is all organic. So over the course of years, it's really going to change and not have the same properties it did the first year that you filled your raised beds with it. I like to have if I'm building a deep raised bed, I want it to be 2 feet or deeper, which allows for 18 inches of plant growth, and then an area underneath that maybe accounts for water logging from bad soil texture interfaces, etc. That's a very brief run through of raised beds.
So this comes up every year, Eric, but people want more information about composting in Colorado specifically. Do you have any good resources for people?
I mean, we have a good fact sheet on it. Composting, guy, I hate to break it to y'all. Composting is one of these things that I think that we overthink. If you're doing a backyard compost pile, well, let's take a step back. If I leave a banana on my kitchen, what happens to it? On my kitchen counter, what happens to it in less than a week? Just think about it. It starts rotting, right? It starts composting. The microorganisms that decompose things are everywhere. And if you want to compost but don't want to overthink it, you can just pile stuff in a compost pile and it will decompose. The extra effort that you put in to aerate it and have the right mix of green and brown materials, all that means is that it decomposes more rapidly and maybe leads to a little better finished product more quickly. So I would recommend checking out our fact sheet. Cassie and I still have a talk on composting on on the Adams County YouTube page that we did this summer. I always hate it because people want composting to be this magical topic that it requires an hour of talking. I mean, stuff decomposes. I mean, you want to make sure your pile is moist but not sopping wet. You want to turn it as frequently as you can manage with a pitchfork or some other, even a shovel to aerate it. You want to add green to brown and about a 2-to-1 ratio of brown stuff to green. Brown would be like your leaf, your paper, your leaf, high carbon stuff, brown stuff. So it's like a leaves, paper, etc. Green would be your fresh vegetable scraps or your fresh plant scraps. So 2-to-1 ratio of that stuff. Keep it moist but not soaking wet, and aerate it. Don't buy one of those big drums if you haven't bought it. They don't work real well in Colorado, in my opinion. A pile that's on the ground will stay warmer and compost quicker in the winter.
I've included a link to a Plant Talk site that will also link to other fact sheets on the topic of composting. So it's not a topic on its own in our courses. It will be touched upon in a few other courses as we go, but it is not a standalone topic in Green School.
Yeah.
Amy or Cassie, are there other questions that you wanted to pitch to Eric live? Are there other things you're seeing?
I'm on mute. Yeah, there's a lot of questions coming into the chat. We're doing our best to answer them. Let me see if I can find a good one for you, Eric.
I'm looking too. I just don't want to,
I would say a little bit more clarification on tilling versus no tilling.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to cover.
Okay, so that's good. We got about 5 minutes left, and this will fill the 5 minutes.
And while you're looking for that, Eric, I'll bring up a point that was mentioned yesterday of consider what you're growing and how you manage your soil. You're gonna be managing your vegetable beds very differently than you're managing your perennial beds. I said this last night, a lot of our perennials, especially if you're going with those low water or native type perennials, they actually prefer lean soils that don't have a lot of amendment in them. So don't feel like you absolutely have to improve the soil. In some cases, you might go with what's native. So keep that in mind. Always think about what you're growing. So,
yeah.
All right, Eric.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a super tricky point too, because native to where,
right.
the clay in my subdivision is not the clay that the native plants of the area we're growing in. Right. It's had all the organic matter stripped out. It's compacted. So I still probably would want to add some organic matter and loosen it if it's just pure clay, but I'm not worried about having it be 5% and perfect. Right. So that's a really good point. And that's there's a lot more interest in native plants that maybe don't need this 5% that we've always talked about. And so we probably should have modified this course to talk about that. I should anyways. Okay, so real quick, and this is really an issue related mostly to vegetable gardens, but this concept of till versus no till. So we add organic matter for all the reasons I've talked about, right? We add organic matter to create soil structure. We also add it to, provide some nutrients, to help fuel a healthy soil ecology, to create humus, all that stuff. But we run into this issue that I have on this slide. We add organic matter to create and maintain soil structure, but the ways that we add organic matter degrade soil structure, right? We use a rototiller. Those beater bars just beat the heck out of soil structure. Even a shovel is much less hard on soil structure, but it does, do some damage to those aggregates we're trying to form. Also, a thing that's a little more high level is that when we till, when we turn the soil, we're adding a bunch of oxygen to the soil, which kicks the microbes into overdrive and causes them to chew through organic matter much more rapidly. In fact, too rapidly for our purposes as gardeners. And remember that the things holding those soil aggregates together, those sticky things, are organic matter. They have carbon in them and microbes eat them. And so when we add oxygen, those sticky things that bind soil structure together actually start getting decomposed by microbes more rapidly than we would like. So this is an issue. It's not like a new issue. It's been framed since the 70s, that we're trying to maintain soil structure because it's good for plant growth. But when we add organic matter, which we have to do, we have to add organic matter because it's always decomposing. We're breaking up soil structure. And, one of the, one of the ideas that this has led to is the idea of no-till. In big agricultural systems, no-till is accomplished, which means we never turn the soil, is accomplished by leaving areas fallow, by leaving stubble on the field, by using specialized implements that can plant into that untilled soil and still lead to good germination. And that's been, we've been working on that since the 70s, and it's finally reached the point where a lot of like farmers, not all still, who do wheat and other cropping systems where this makes sense are thinking about no-till or using it. And the interest in that has naturally trickled down into vegetable gardening. And we've come up with these, these solutions, which I have here on the slide, right? Where we have no-till or minimal till. We grow cover crops, which we then, cut and leave on as mulch or turn in, which is still tilling, to the soil to avoid minimizing soil structure. But really for us as vegetable gardeners, I've thought about this a lot. I've read all the stuff online about no-till vegetable gardens. I think for a lot of your crops, it's just vegetable crops. It's very difficult to do no-till and get good germination. Like your seed bed is just not, it's not desirable enough. It's not granular enough to get good germination. Not to say you can't do it, but I still think you're going to want to prepare your seed bed. And again, you're going to want to add organic matter into your vegetable garden at some point. So instead of no-till for most vegetable gardens, I'm in favor of kind of minimal till and less invasive tilling, which means that we maybe only turn it once a year when we add our compost, right? Or we add whatever organic matter we're adding. And we do it in a way that is less invasive than a rototiller if we can manage it physically. And not all of us are physically capable of amending a bed without a rototiller. That's a thing that I think is also important, right? We use a shovel or we use a fancy thing called a broad fork. So a shovel is less hard on soil structure than this rototiller. And then this broad fork, which is essentially, it has on it these big tines, which are not this way, but this way along the fork. So you add your organic matter, you stick this broad fork in, and then you pull it back and you kind of like lift the soil, but don't turn it, and the organic matter slides down between the cracks. So it's much less invasive to soil structure than even a shovel. The first couple of years you use a broad fork, you'll find you are turning the soil, probably has been my experience, because the soil is just not aggregated well enough to let the tines slide through it. You'll find you are doing some turning, but over like plowing a little bit, but over time you'll find that the broad fork moves through the soil better, and your organic matter that you add will slip through the cracks. It also helps afterwards. You can lightly rake you can lightly rake the surface of the soil after you've done the broad fork to create a little better seed bed, to get a little better germination. So hopefully that answers the question. No-till is just, the idea of that is we don't want to till because it disturbs the soil structure. It disturbs soil life. But in vegetable gardening systems, home vegetable gardening systems, I think you're going to have to do some tilling, at least some loosening of the soil to prepare a better seed bed, especially for your small seeded vegetable crops. Hopefully that makes sense.
Well done. I think, this is a really huge topic, as we talked about in the beginning, and to cover what we did in an hour and a half is really impressive, Eric. So thank you so much. And thanks to Amy and Cassie for hopping on the chat and getting back to so many people so quickly. If you have a question that didn't get answered, you still have something on top of mind, Eric has been gracious enough to offer his email address, both in the Canvas course online. You can find his email there. It's also listed in the chat box now. So he's happy to follow up over the next couple of weeks if there are questions on this material. Eric, any final words?
Have fun.
Good luck.
We did have one person who requested if they can have a couple minutes to read through the Q&A.
Yeah, we'll keep it open for just a few minutes, but we're going to try to find a way to capture the Q&A and potentially post that when we post the recording, because I think there's a lot of rich information here that people may be interested in pouring back over. We have 75 answered questions posted right now, so a pretty busy morning. This has been really fun. It's great to see how interactive we've been able to be, despite the platform of Zoom and being remote. So thanks. We have folks joining us from all across the state. Soils differ across the state, so you know, this really is an enormous task to be able to cover this material for this type of audience across the state. And Eric, thanks again for being with us and taking the time both last night and today.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me.